Alright. Hey guys, welcome back to another video. Today we are going to say Ukraine 1,000 times to support them because I'm out of my goddamn mind. The video might take a while. Oh, hold up guys, can that's a new flavor? Nope. Alright. Never did this before. After I swallow this gummy, we will start. Ukraine, 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 Ukraine. God damn, I'm already at 40 and it's hard. Ukraine, 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 Ukraine. Ukraine, 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 Ukraine. Ukraine, 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 Ukraine. Oh. Ukraine. The fuck? Ukraine, Ukraine, Ukraine. Ukraine. You. Fucking Ukraine. Ukraine. Ukraine, 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 Ukraine. I missed it twice. Ukraine, 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 UK, Ukraine. Ukraine, 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 Ukraine. 900 left. Ukraine, 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 Ukraine. Ukraine, 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 Ukraine. Ukraine, 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 Ukraine! Oh my. Ukraine, 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 Ukraine. Ukraine, 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 Ukraine. Ukraine. Ukraine, 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 Ukraine. Huh? No. Huh? No, that's me walking on. Ukraine, 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 Ukraine. Hey, Dad, I'm just saying Ukraine 1,000 times.
Ukraine.
That don't count.
Ukraine.
Look how many. Wanna know how many times I said Ukraine?
How many?
167.
Wow.
A lot more to go. Oh my God, guys. Ukraine, 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 Ukraine. Ukraine, 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 Ukraine. Ukraine, 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 Ukraine. I'm gonna grab a drink for Ukraine.
How was the beach? Was the water cold? Yeah?
No.
You know why? Because the Gulf Stream. Ever hear of the Gulf Stream?
No, I don't know.
It probably shifted, and well, it's warmer water.
Ukraine.
Oh,
Ukraine.
Dog, please. If you're gonna do that, go in there and do it. Oh, you got a pop.
Yeah. Ukraine. No! I'll just go back to what I was at. I messed up. I pressed reset. Gotta go back to 192. That sucks.
Watch this. Watch this. Look, we got a new TV. That's a new TV.
That's a new TV?
Me and Ricky picked it up.
That doesn't look new.
Watch it.
That doesn't look new. Oh, what the fuck?
Jacked him up.
What the fuck? What the fuck? Two. Ukraine, 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 Ukraine. 200! Ukraine! Oh, fuck Russia. We like Ukraine. Ukraine, 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 Ukraine. Oh, fuck! Fuck! I gotta go all the way back to 20 goddamn 4. I'm a motherfucker. Proceed, you motherfucker. Oh my god, motherfucker. I'll be right back. Alright guys, I'm back. Ukraine, Ukraine. Ukraine, 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 Ukraine. That was good. Alright. I'm gonna do some math real quick. How the fuck did I turn this? Okay. So if I'm at 226. No, what the fuck? If I need not 10,000. Ukraine. If I need 1,000. So I just have to minus that from what I'm at. Minus 227 equals 773 more Ukraine. Make it.
What's going on in here? What are you doing?
Saying Ukraine 1,000 times.
Ukraine?
Yeah, cause I'm
Why
out.
are you saying that 1,000 times?
Cause I'm out of my fucking mind.
You are out of your mind, but you don't have to be out of your fucking mind.
Shut the fuck up. Ukraine, 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 Ukraine. Ukraine, 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 Ukraine! Just 699 more Ukraines to go. Make that 698 to go. Yeah, you see what I did? I didn't say Ukraine. Fuck! Ukraine, 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 Ukraine. Ukraine. Ukraine, 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 Ukraine. Fuck. Ukraine, 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 Ukraine. Ukraine, 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 Ukraine. Ukraine, 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 Ukraine. Alright guys, if this video gets 1,000,000 likes, 10,000 likes, I'll say Ukraine, 10,000. I'll say fuck Russia 10,000 times. Fuck Russia, we love Ukraine, 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 Ukraine! Fuck! Ukraine. Fuck Russia, we love Ukraine, Ukraine, Ukraine. Missed it. Ukraine, 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 Ukraine. Ukraine, 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 Ukraine. Ukraine, 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 Ukraine. And guys, I'm gonna put my webcam over here. Now I'm up here. Ukraine, 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 Ukraine. Ukraine. Ukraine, 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 Ukraine. Ukraine, 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 Ukraine. Fuck. Fuck is that? Ukraine, 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 Ukraine. Ukraine, Ukraine, Ukraine. 600 to go. Goddamn. Alright guys, we're going to take a walk.
I remember the 345. What the F are you doing?
What the fuck are you
No,
doing?
no, man, don't use that word. You're too little.
I don't give a fuck. Ukraine, 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 Ukraine. Ukraine. Hey, Dad, guess how many times I said Ukraine?
I don't know, Doc.
407.
Who's that?
Your girlfriend?
I'm gonna say
Alright, don't. Oh crap. My bad, I'm recording. Ukraine, 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 Ukraine. Ukraine. Ukraine, Ukraine. Ukraine, 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 you fucking crane. Ukraine, 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 Ukraine. Ukraine, Ukraine, Ukraine. You fucking Ukraine! Ukraine, 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 Ukraine. Ukraine, 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 Ukraine. Ukraine, 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 Ukraine. Ukraine, 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 Ukraine. Ukraine, 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 Ukraine. Ukraine. Ukraine, 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 Ukraine. Ukraine, 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 Ukraine. Ukraine, 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 Ukraine. 500 more, I'm almost dead. Ukraine, 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 Ukraine. Ukraine, 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 Ukraine. Ukraine, 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 Ukraine. Ukraine, Ukraine, Ukraine. Ukraine, 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 Ukraine. Ukraine. Ukraine, 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 Ukraine. Ukraine, 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 Ukraine. Ukraine, Ukraine, Ukraine. Ukraine, 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 Ukraine. Ukraine, 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 Ukraine. Ukraine, Ukraine, Ukraine. Ukraine, 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 Ukraine. Ukraine, Ukraine, Ukraine. Ukraine, 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 Ukraine. Fucking Ukraine. Ukraine, Ukraine, Ukraine. Ukraine, 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 Ukraine. Ukraine, 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 Ukraine. Ukraine, Ukraine, Ukraine. Ukraine! What the fuck is this? Cool. Wait, that bitch died in 2003? What a fucker. We did that celebration in 21. He died in fucking 03. I'm talking about 2003 and 2021 Ukraine. Bro, fuck that. Ukraine, 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 Ukraine. Ukraine, 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 Ukraine. 400 more Ukraines. Ukraine, Ukraine, Ukraine. Ukraine. Oh, then click it. Ukraine, 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 Ukraine. Ukraine, 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 Ukraine. I'm gonna click it 8 times and then say Ukraine 8 times. Ukraine, 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 Ukraine. Ukraine, 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 Ukraine. Ukraine, 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 Ukraine. Ukraine, 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 Ukraine. Ukraine, 69 Ukraine, 69 Ukraine, 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 Ukraine. Ukraine, 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 Let me finish this. Let me finish this. Ukraine, 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 Ukraine. Ukraine. Ukraine, 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 Ukraine. Ukraine, 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 Ukraine. 300 fucking more. Ukraine, Ukraine. Ukraine. Ukraine, 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 Ukraine. Ukraine, 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 Ukraine. Ukraine, 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 Ukraine. Nobody's gonna fucking watch this. Ukraine! Ukraine, Ukraine, Ukraine. Ukraine, 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 Ukraine. Please fuck Russia, fuck Russia, fuck Russia, fuck Russia, fuck Russia, fuck Russia. It's easier than saying Ukraine, 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 fuck Russia, Ukraine. Ukraine, Ukraine, Ukraine. Ukraine, 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 I'm gay. Oh, I'm just playing, I'm not gay, I'm not that fucking Ukrainian retarded. Like, okay. Ukraine, Ukraine, just in case. Ukraine, Ukraine, Ukraine. I'm gonna say Ukraine 10 times. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Ukraine, 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 Ukraine. Ukraine, 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 Ukraine. Ukraine, 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 Ukraine. I missed it. Ukraine, 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 hold up. Let's see how far away I am. 1,000. Alright. $223 away from finishing this Ukraine. Alright, now shut the fuck up. Ukraine, 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 Ukraine! Ukraine, 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 Ukraine. 200 more! Ukraine, 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 Ukraine. Ukraine, Ukraine, Ukraine. If I was saying this 10,000 times, I'd be pissed the fuck off. Ukraine, 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 Ukraine. Ukraine, Ukraine. My next Ukraine video, I'll say Ukraine 5,000 times if I have the time. Ukraine, 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 Ukraine. Ukraine, 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 you fucking crane! Ukraine, 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 Ukraine. Ukraine, 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 Ukraine. You're wondering why I clicked into say Ukraine is when I had to drink in my mouth. Ukraine, 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 Ukraine. Ukraine, 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 you! Ukraine, 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 Ukraine. Holy shit, 100 more and I'm done saying Ukraine! Ukraine, Ukraine, Ukraine. Ukraine, 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 Ukraine. Ukraine, 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 Ukraine. Oh, what the fuck's 1 second? Ukraine, 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 Ukraine. Oh, Ukraine. Wait a minute. Hold up, bro. Ukraine, 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 Ukraine. Ukraine, 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 Ukraine. Oh my god. 80 more? Wait, what? 80? How the fuck do I have 80? I would have 50 more. No, 70 more. That's right. No, that'd be free. So I have 60 left. Ukraine, 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 Ukraine. Oh, I missed one. 10 left, and I'm done saying Ukraine, 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 Ukraine. Once I say this country one more time, we're done. The big 1,000. Ukraine! Oh, I did it. I actually fucking did it. Holy shit, I said Ukraine 1,000 times. Took 27 minutes and some seconds. That's fucking crazy. I can hardly breathe. Yes. I did it. I said Ukraine 1,001 times for a bonus. Alright guys, that's a wrap for the video. Hope you enjoyed.